Thank you very much. QR code, thanks to Matthew's comment earlier about only young people use QR codes. You may notice I've also done my entire presentation in Comic Sans MS, which was sort of done out of a sense of perversity, but then I had a couple of people point out something which I thought everyone should know. Apparently it's really good if you're dyslexic. And it turns out this font has been getting all this hate for all these years. And really, it's actually really, really good for a whole bunch of people, which I just thought was interesting to know. You'll notice I also am no longer advertising my Twitter profile because I'm not really into Nazis. But you can find me on LinkedIn. If you told me 10 years ago I would get more value out of the social networks of LinkedIn and Reddit than Twitter, I probably would have wondered what the hell was going on. For those of you who aren't English or Australian, that is Vegemite on the toast there, not Marmite, which is a significantly inferior product. So, my name's Nigel Kirsten. I'm currently VP of Product Engineering at Synadia, a company who makes an open source messaging broker. Before that, I spent like 12 years being CTO, VP of Engineering at Puppet, an infrastructure as code company. And I spent over a decade writing State of DevOps Reports, taking DevOps from the really early days when no one had any idea what it was to much later when still no one had any idea what it was, but lots of companies made money out of it. Full disclosure here, for those of you who've done presentations before, I wrote this abstract about 4 or 5 months ago, and I wrote the talk about 5 days ago. It felt very much like an assignment a stranger had set me. And I was definitely feeling, I think, really cynical. This is Diogenes, who was the founder of cynicism. That's the DevOps infinite loop there, in case you're wondering. And I was definitely feeling a bit cynical about this big movement that I'd been a big part of for like 12 years. And in fact, about a lot of cultural change programs. A lot of my last 4 or 5 years at Puppet was working pretty closely with huge multinational banks, large organizations, trying to drive change. I'm not trying to be mean in this presentation. If I'm mean, someone please call me out. It was more feeling cynical about myself rather than mean about this whole movement. Massive believer in domain-driven design, Wardley mapping, team topologies. These frameworks are massively useful for actually changing things. That being said, this is Peter Drucker, who came out with so many amazing management aphorisms. Some are really true, some are just not, but sound really pithy. He came up with this one that was culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what he was trying to get at here was if you have a really great plan as an organization, clear goals, a way you're going to attack a market, if your company culture sucks, it's not really going to work. And you may have heard this framed in other ways of, like great people with bad plans will out-execute bad people with good plans, things like that. I'd been thinking about this a lot, and I think particularly through the whole DevOps. Let me just stop for a sec. How many of you know what DevOps is or have thought about it a bit? Okay, well, yeah, the or was important there. Also curious, how many of you help organizations transform? Stick your hand up there if you're in that sort of business. How many of you are trying to transform your own organization? Okay. How many of you work in a business that's primarily about building software? Okay, cool. Hopefully some of you will get this then. I was trying to work out whether I'd pitch this. So I'd been thinking about this a lot, and I've been thinking about how a lot of the big changes that I'd seen actually drive technical, cultural change in organizations weren't due to cultural programs. They were due to software just coming along and changing the game. So for example, one big one that I feel like we missed at Puppet was Docker and containers. And it was because we're all ops people, and if you come from this world, containers are a shitty packaging system. We had better packaging systems. But what we missed was the fact that it changed who had access to be able to package software. Like it fundamentally democratized that process so that rather than the ops people, the greybeard sysadmins, I'm sure some of you in the crowd, being the gatekeepers of this tech and this process, suddenly any dev could do it. And that actually made a really huge difference. I'd say too, there's a similar story with, for those who know the space I was in, Puppet versus Ansible, in that you didn't need to ask anyone's permission to use Ansible. Whereas Puppet required you set up a central server. I would still argue it's a better system, but it sort of doesn't matter if it's better compared to more people having access to it. So this is sort of the premise of my talk, that it's actually software that changes these things. And in particular, I was feeling really cynical because I'd been working lots of big orgs, spending millions of pounds, millions of dollars on ways of working programs, like stuff like this. We're all going to get better at doing everything, and just nothing ever changed. But what seemed to actually change things was something like cloud. So like, I still think the most valuable thing cloud did for most organizations was literally just wipe away organizational scar tissue. It let them break down silos of the network people, the storage people, the provisioning people, the middleware, and suddenly a team that wanted to do stuff could just do stuff. It wasn't really about, you couldn't have done that in most big orgs by trying to just go, hey, let's collect a group of people together and we'll build APIs for them. It sort of required the tech to change everything. This is a stat I have used in like multiple presentations. You've probably seen it somewhere or other. 70% of all change management programs fail. I was looking to source this and work out where it actually came from. I spent an hour or so on the internet until I found this guy who basically found out it's bullshit. It's not actually true. It's this distortion. I highly recommend going and finding this video. This is David J. Wilkinson here in the UK from the Oxford Review. And he goes and traces it all the way through. It's like this fascinating story of distortion, games of telephone, all sorts of things. So anyway, this isn't true. However, I do think I've seen way more cultural change programs fail than succeed. Anecdata, but yes, here we go. So what I want to try and get at too is I was feeling a bit cynical about the DevOps movement and our sort of focus on culture that we'd had, and focusing it on as an input rather than an output of the way we were changing processes and teams and organizational dynamics. This is actually why I fell in love with the team topologies work so quickly, because it stopped talking about fuzzy culture things and was talking about specific organizational dynamics issues that you fixed with pretty specific constraints and prescriptive methods. What I would like to, and this sounds a bit high and mighty, but I've seen the platform engineering space start to do this, like platform engineering culture, like start to talk about this as a thing that you focus on yourself rather than focusing on specific problems and fixing them. So if you Google for DevOps culture, this kind of actually horrified me. You get about 28 million results. And for those of you who went to lots of the early DevOps days, there were lots of talks about culture, how to increase collaboration, how to change your DevOps culture. And I think a lot of this came from the fact that most people had experience running teams rather than organizations. And there's things you can do deliberately about changing the culture of a team that are possible and within your grasp. But it's not the same when you run hundreds or thousands of people inside a much larger organization. So to do a quick tour, you might have seen this framework. It started off as CAMs and then became CALMs, Culture, Automation, Lean, Measurement, Sharing. This is all over the internet. There are so many vendors who put things here. I apologize if any of you are on this list. I've tried to censor the worst possible ones. These are everywhere. There are so many different pictograms of this. Everyone has had a go at framing DevOps culture in one way or another. This is part 1 of 500 of this particular series. You even get a little pyramid. I'm not actually quite sure why this one is a pyramid. It sort of makes sense, but maybe not. This one's a little bit different. What do we got? Culture, automation, recovery, measurement, lean flow. I'm not sure what that spells out. And then now I understand why English people absolutely despise these things. They're everywhere. Keep calms and carry on. But perhaps the worst of them all, and I had to censor this particular vendor, is you can pay $150 US to do a small course to be a certified DevOps culture practitioner. If you don't know the origin of this image, the phrase jumping the shark was from an episode of Happy Days where it had gone completely off the rails and the Fonz literally took a bet to jump a shark in some water skis. Some of you probably don't even know who the Fonz is. Anyway, I share the blame for this. Before I come across as seeming sort of mean, I did 11 years of these reports. I think we did the platform engineering one at Puppet at the beginning of this year, just before I left. And I'd been doing these for years and years. And we used CAMs as a framework to build out a DevOps evolutionary framework. We talked about DevOps culture. But I'm not actually sure it was all that useful for us as an industry or even as a movement. I think I'm proud of the report. I think all the different co-authors I worked with over the years, we did lots of really good stuff. But I think we talked about culture in a way that is not actually useful. It actually took Matt and Manuel, in the last one that we did with them, to come up with a phrase that I'm going to show in a sec. The thing about culture, and I think Simon Wardley, who's been mentioned a bunch of times here on Twitter, was the first one to draw my attention to this. We keep using this word, and yet we don't actually know what it means. If you look at anthropology, literally the study of culture, they don't agree on what culture is. The closest they get is this foundational one from this magnificently bearded gentleman, Edward Tyler. That complex whole that includes knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by as members of society. That's so broad it's not particularly useful. Even if you get to modern anthropology, these 4 pillars that we have here, shared by a population, learned and acquired during childhood, none of this is really relevant to what we're talking about when we talk about we have a culture of this, we have a culture of that inside organizations. This was the quote, I can't remember if it was Matt or Manuel when we first collaborated with them on one of the State DevOps reports. Thinking about organizational problems as culture is neither useful nor actionable. And I think even worse than that, if you start describing a problem as being a culture problem, it starts to be so big no one will try and fix it. It starts to be like the weather. It's just like, oh, we have a culture of poor decision making. We have a culture of being slow. We have a culture of poor, like, none of these things actually help you fix anything or even really get better. Here's my premise. I actually think it's new software capabilities that drive cultural change, so long as, and I'm talking about, again, at scale here, I've recently joined a really small startup of like 20 to 30 people, and the problems are completely different, just completely different. You can actually drive cultural change in a small group of people. But I think so long as leadership recognizes what's going on technology-wise and takes advantage of and amplifies it, this has to happen first in most big organizations before you actually get meaningful change in that amorphous mess of stuff we tend to call culture. Now, before you think that I might be advocating for some world where software rules everything and we all, the singularity happens and we all get uploaded onto the blockchain, living around Mars for some reason, I am absolutely not one of these people. I'm a philosophy grad, is my actual background before I got into SRE and operations and programming. I've always been fascinated by the human interaction of all this stuff, so please don't take any of this as me going, you can fix all of these problems with software. I'm also absolutely not a Taylorist, which is a word that a few of you have mentioned today in various different talks. I don't think that you can reduce humanity to, the Matrix, tapping away at sort of little parts of a big hamster wheel. And it can't improve everything. There are things that are real problems inside a lot of our organizations around racism, around sexism, not being kind to each other, having unclear objectives. You're not going to fix all of these things with software. No OKR tool is going to make you better at setting goals for your organization. But there are things that we call culture that you can actually fix. Slow feedback loops, having too many approval steps between parts of a process, being slow at decision-making because context is difficult to shift from one part of the org to another, a lack of autonomy for a team in trying to get their job done, inability to actually iterate on things. A lot of these things do get fixed by software. For those of you who've been around for a while, version control really used to suck. It was really hard to collaborate on a code base. We just didn't have a model for it. Testing software used to be really difficult. It was difficult to actually release things and iterate on them quickly because you had this slow process of humans having to tap away at things and check whether they worked. And we still need to think about the social impact of our technical tools and our choices, because they do. And I think this is what I'm trying to get at. And I realize I might be a little incoherent here, but it's like, I think software matters as a premise and the technology creates capabilities. But we've got to think about what those things are, because technical choices have impact upon our social dynamic. We are a sociotechnical system, and this has become the word du jour amongst this whole sort of space of, everything is a sociotechnical system. But I think it's true. This is one of the simpler diagrams here. I don't pretend to do justice to what is like a serious academic field analyzing all this, but Technical choices have impact upon people, they have impact upon the structure of the org, on the tasks, and all of these things flow back and forth. So again, not saying we're all, software has primacy over all this, but I think it means that you can't just focus on the social side of things and expect change to happen. You've sort of got to take advantage of these big technology changes. I don't think most big organizations, back to my cloud comment, can actually fundamentally change the way they build, ship, release, and maintain software without some kind of technology changing what's possible. Pre-virtualization, it was really difficult to do a whole bunch of things. You had to get someone to rack and stack the servers, someone to install the OS, someone to set up the network, someone to attach storage. Like, as we've moved up higher and higher level abstractions, more things are possible. You probably didn't know many people doing DevOps or even doing something like value stream aligned teams, platform teams, before a lot of this technology, because it sort of had to be there first. If the companies that did it were the ones like the Netflixes, the Googles, etc., who literally had armies of software engineers building these things. I mean, when I arrived at Google in 2007, and it felt like an alien landscape, tech-wise. I'd come from a public university in Australia where we had no money, we had to scramble together everything with a team of 5 people. And then I arrived and suddenly it was just like, there were these container things and this orchestrator thing and this sort of observability tracing, and it was just fundamentally a different world. So I think this is one of the big problems that we had in the DevOps space is, and I'd hate to see any sort of post-DevOps movements fall victim to the same problem, which was talking about culture disconnected from the tech. I think one of the biggest problems we had in that whole movement was we were all friends, and most of us in the early days ended up going to work for software vendors that sort of helped shape that space. But because we were friends, we didn't actually criticize each other's tools at all. There was sort of this unspoken truce at a DevOps days where the Chef people didn't trash the Puppet people, didn't trash the Ansible people, the Salt people. Like, all of these tools sort of had a truce, but I think it held us back from honest criticism about the social and organizational dynamics impact of adopting those tools. If you adopt a tool that has a centralized system where there's a gatekeeper who has to approve things that go into it, you fundamentally enable a different organization to one where everyone can just run it from their laptop. And maybe we should have focused on different aspects of that. You couldn't have had DevOps, again to my point, without some of these things appearing. Like, the reason it appeared at that time wasn't just because Patrick Dubois and Andrew Schaefer and the sort of luminaries of that world went, hey, this thing's a good idea. We needed stuff like this to exist. We needed good higher level programming languages that weren't Perl, that weren't PHP, to actually exist. The fact that Ruby and Python and things had appeared, that we had REST APIs, we weren't dealing with XML-RPC and all of this crap that made stuff really difficult before, meant you were democratizing stuff. More people had access to actually program things. We needed infrastructure as code tools. You needed to be able to start treating the operating system like it had an API, even though it was never really designed to have one. And we needed virtualization in cloud so that fewer people had to be asked for permission to get stuff done. I forgot to start my timer, so you will need to. Okay, this is one of the other big myths. DevOps is about collaboration. But you know what? Collaboration sucks. It's really inefficient. It's really good in parts, and this is, I think, one of the key team topologies insights. Collaborate at the design phase. But you know what's efficient for delivering services? As a service. You're not collaborating with Amazon every time you go and buy something from them. They didn't become massive by having a person go, hey, what kind of toothbrush would you like to buy? It's like, I want a toothbrush. Give me a toothbrush. This is the other thing, and a few of you have brought up brainstorming, and again, I really don't want to be unkind here, but I've come to despise most brainstorming sessions. I actually don't think they're usually all that productive. A few of you here, there was a brain writing model someone, I think, came up with that I really, really liked. It turns out the wisdom of the crowds only works if everyone makes judgments on their own. If you get a group of people together to agree on something, it's generally a bad decision. But if you get them all to make an independent judgment and then you average them out, it tends to be much better. There's all sorts of problems. This is Solomon Asch, who is a social psych pioneer. He has these fascinating studies where he got people together to go, There was 3 lines and another line that was clearly the same size as one of them and not the other 2. And he would ask people, which one of these lines matches that one? If you asked everyone individually, 99.9% got that right. As soon as he put someone into groups who was like, no, it's the short one, it turns out all these other people go along with this idea, even though they know that it's wrong. We're not actually all that great in groups unless you put structure around it and get people to do work ahead of time. So I think collaboration is grossly overrated. Okay, so let's get to some data here. So we did this report on trying to work out what was holding back organizations from actually being good at this thing called DevOps. This is when we started working with Manuel and Matt pretty well. And we found out that the biggest thing, which is sort of no shock to most of you, is it's not technology, it's organizational structure and dynamics. And the most evolved kinds of orgs, and I'm just focusing on 2 here, were essentially down to value streams and platform teams. Platform groups, I didn't correct that one. And the big one, all the orgs that were best at doing DevOps turned out to be just the best orgs overall, where their teams knew what they did, teams next to them knew what they did, which doesn't actually seem like rocket science. But so what were the problems actually being solved here? And this is probably pretty obvious to most of you here because we're at a fast flow conference and most of you have read team topologies, but interactions between teams are expensive. And the thing that is always really expensive and that I often focus on when I'm trying to help orgs get better is if you have to write down context and give it to someone who didn't have the context so they can be part of the decision, that's just expensive. This is why teams can make good decisions themselves, because they already have the right context. This is why change management boards suck, because a team that knows what the context is around something has to write it down, give it to someone who has no idea, or even worse, 30 people who have no idea, and then they all make a decision about it. If you slice, and again, should not be a shock to you all, if you slice by functional areas, so you have a network team here, a security team, a storage team over here, that are separate from the people trying to ship value to someone, you're just going to get lots of expensive handoffs. And collaborating between these people is not going to solve the problem. We can't actually do stream-aligned and platform groups without any of these things. I mean, maybe without some of them, but imagine a world like, cast your mind back to the mid-90s and the tech we had available. It would have been really, really difficult to take an organization and go, you know what, let's have a small dev team and have them own everything soup to nuts around shipping value to a user. So these are worthwhile organizational patterns to aim at, but I think it's important to recognize that they're enabled by fundamental technology shifts. And maybe one of the things I'm trying to get at here is, if you look at the team topologies model, which is, I think, amazing in terms of constraints and creating progress and all these things, it's enabled by a bunch of tech. And we should keep looking at new tech and what it enables, because we might get new kinds of models that are just as good. So this is, again, the pretty obvious thing. If you want these things, you need X as a service. If you want to avoid lots of handoffs, but because you're a business, you need to avoid risk, you need to have guardrails in place, you need to have your experts produce things that are self-service that the people who have less expertise can use. If you think about the expertise required to be a really, really good network admin, like, you don't need all of that expertise to be able to make network decisions around your application, so long as you've been given the right guardrails. And this is something I spent a lot of time in the last 5 or 6 years doing with big orgs, is working out what kind of automation is required to deliver something as a service. And it boils down to these things for me. You've got to have an abstraction so that the consumers of the automation are not experts. Producers have to be able to have guardrails. They have to be able to go, you know what? You can't screw up the whole network across my core banking application just because you need to open up a firewall port. You also need to be able to give consumers the ability to customize the service and compose them together. For those of you who lived through the days of enterprise service catalogs, where you had these big monolithic things, you went, I want an X. And most of the time, what you needed diverged somewhat from the thing being offered, and you didn't have an ability to customize that, you didn't have an ability to compose those things to address new problems. Like, that was why people stopped using those services and you got shadow IT. And then I think finally, the lesson every SaaS provider has learned, you've got to be able to know how your consumers are using the service to work out what's popular, what's no longer popular, what things are people using, so that you can advance it and use your actual product thinking for your platform. So to sort of draw a few more analogies here, I think, software can force teams to be tightly coupled together. This is your classic service mesh. So a lot of this is the space I work in these days and the sort of deployments we're getting rid of. But if you look at this, it is almost impossible for these teams to not be tightly coupled together because they have all sorts of dependencies outside the team in order to get stuff done. And if you look at what people tried to do to fix this, the classic enterprise service bus, it started off working really well, but so much logic ended up being pushed into the service bus itself that you ended up centralizing power and disempowering all of these teams on the outside. The choices you make architecturally for your software determine how teams are coupled. And this is sort of the insight of team topologies. But you can also set people free. And this is as close to a product pitch as I'm going to get because there's other tools in this space. But if you're building microservices applications and you have a modern message bus, teams can operate independently of each other. And this has become the thing for me as far as looking at technology that I think is worth betting on, that's worth organizing your company around, which is what are the things that cause you to not have to ask permission as much? And what are the things that let teams operate independently? So ultimately, I think I'm coming up with what I was trying to come up with something pithier, but this is the closest. New technology enables new organizational topologies which enable better execution of new software architectures. And I'm sure there's a pithier way, I'll get to that at some point. But it's like, if the insight of inverse Conway's law was that we should structure our organizations in the way we want our software to be structured so that it's easier to deliver, I think we should be keeping an eye on the fact that new kinds of tech will enable new kinds of models which will enable us to deliver software differently. And that's it. Thank you. I'm also colorblind, so I decided to do as much as grey and black and white as possible. Hopefully you could all see it.
Cool. Thank you, Nigel. We've got questions. We've got time. We've got about 5 minutes if people have questions.
You said in your talk that you're at a smaller firm now, a startup, like 20, 30 people. How has some of the ideas you formed at large firms influenced how you operate now at a small firm?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think two things. I think one was I joined Puppet at about 8 people. We hit 700, I think, down to 500, up to 600, down to it was a hell of a ride. Decisions you make early at a startup reverberate through its history. For years, they become difficult to undo. And I think one of the challenges at a small firm is not being paralyzed by knowing that, but recognizing it at the same time. I will say I'm basically trying to take 2 sort of bodies of work as my main, North Stars. One is Empowered Product Teams by Marty Kagan. For any of you who are product people, literally he's absolutely the best. So I'm trying to build small empowered teams, but pairing that with team topologies. I think the challenge when you have a really small organization is you don't have enough people to staff up all of those teams. But I think the core ideas of going, what's the mandate of the team? Do other teams understand that mandate? And do they know what they're responsible for shipping and to whom? And so I think, it's value streams. Trying to do that from the beginning has been really interesting, particularly at a small startup, for those of you who've done it, where you always have 4 or 5 people who are just amazing at everything and they're doing everything. And my biggest challenge in some ways for any of them who happen to be watching this is getting them to stop and sort of recognizing that the better long-term health of the business is getting them to focus, even though they're amazing at something, sort of letting it drop and giving them focus and modeling that for the rest of the org. I think that's been the big challenge. But I think the fundamental idea of complicated subsystem team, weirdly enough, was the bit that resonated the most with all of my engineers. They were like, oh yeah, that stuff's really complicated. That little team should be focused on that.